Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this Lighthouse Illumination webinar today. The topic of the webinar is The Debate is On, TAR 1.0 or 2.0 for HSR second request. I'm excited to introduce shortly a great panel of speakers from Lighthouse, Kirkland & Ellis, and Denton. But first, before we get started, I'm going to start with a few housekeeping items. First, a PDF copy of the deck will be provided after the presentation. At the top of the survey link, the recording will be made available later this week. Please feel free to submit any questions or comments that you may have throughout today's webinar in the chat at any time. So we have a good number of attendees, but we would really like to make this as interactive as possible, and the panel is looking forward to seeing some questions from the group and really try to interact with you all in real time. Also, an important note for those looking for CLE credit, the survey shared at the end of today's presentation is mandatory. So at the end of the session, make sure you look in the comments box. There'll be a link where you can go in and complete the quick CLE survey question. So don't forget about that to earn your CLE credit. So thank you all again for joining today and investing the time in this conversation. We really appreciate it. So first, we're just going to introduce today's speakers. I'm Chris Stevens. I'm a Senior Director in the Client Services Group here at Lighthouse. And then now I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed panel for their own introduction. So June, we'll start with you.
A competition group at the law firm of Kirkland & Ellis. My practice focuses on mergers and government investigations with a focus on e-discovery.
Okay, I guess I'm next. I'm Jessica Bazan. I am of counsel at Kirkland & Ellis. I work very closely with June. And I'm also part of the antitrust and competition regulatory group there and focus on large-scale e-discovery and primarily second request.
And my name is Asha Derriwa. I'm counsel at Denton. And I have also spent my career helping companies through antitrust merger investigation, second request, and using technology to be able to get through it as efficiently as possible.
Great. And I'm David Bruno. I'm a senior consultant at with Focus Discovery team at Lighthouse. Started working with e-discovery about 17 years ago and have been working with TAR and supporting clients on TAR projects in the different platforms over the last, I guess, 9 years. And looking forward to talking to you today.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And special thanks to June, Azra, and Jessica for being a part of this webinar and working with us on this. We really do appreciate your efforts here. So thank you. Quick, just a rundown of the agenda for today. First, we're going to start off by just level setting on what TAR 1.0 and 2.0 are. Recognize that there may be some folks in the audience that aren't necessarily familiar with that terminology, so we're going to start there with some definitions around the two different models. Then we're going to move into talking about some of the key differences between 1.0 and 2.0, when to use TAR 1.0 or 2.0, some key strategies for negotiating either model with the different regulatory agencies, specifically the FTC and the DOJ. We're going to talk about some best practices around using both models. And a lot of the best practices will apply to both models, but we'll also go into some best practices related to the specific models as well. And then we're going to reserve some time at the end for some Q&A. So again, feel free to shoot questions or comments at any point during the presentation. We'll see those in real time and we'll look to answer them. And then we'll also work to address questions during the Q&A as well. So to get things started, we're going to level set around what TAR 1.0 and 2.0 are. So David, can you give us some definitions around TAR 1.0 and 2.0?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, to start with, when we are talking about TAR, it is technology-assisted review, which is sort of also other terms you'll hear: predictive coding, machine learning, et cetera. So that's the basis of the technology and TAR. When we're speaking of TAR 1.0, it is sort of the original predictive coding. It's a simple active, simple passive learning, depending on which platform you're using. And really where that process is that you will go in and the system is trained by an individual or a small group of subject matter experts. They're looking at reviewing a control set, a small control set, and then an iterative training rounds to reach stability. So we're talking about you're training the model first, you're training the system, developing the model. Once the model is developed, you apply the learning to the data set, and you'll receive scores across the data set, and the scores are what's able to be used. The methods of training, they're not to go too deep into too many terms, but there's different methodologies. You'll hear things that influential rounds, training influential rounds, and really what that's doing is the system is looking for those documents that are the sort of broadest appeal, the most representative of other documents, and that have conceptual similar documents in the set, and which the system doesn't know about. And so it's trying to make the rapid development of the model learn as fast as it can. And you'll usually start with influential type training, and then you get into things that are sort of the term active learning. So it's looking at what the system learned from previous rounds, looking at what it knows about the data set, and finding documents that it doesn't yet know about and understand, and bring those to the forefront for review. And so using those iterative processes, again, we'll get the classification model, we'll get scores, and you're able to then identify the cutoff point, looking at what needs to be reviewed above the cutoff point, a cutoff score, and those documents that don't need to be reviewed further or dealt with that are below. So that's the traditional TAR 1.0 model. The 2.0 model is more recent, the continuous active learning. Depending on the systems and platforms, you'll see things like active learning or continuous multimodal learning. And that is where the training is ongoing. So as the documents are being reviewed by the team, and it's usually done by a broader team than just a small team that is traditionally in the TAR 1.0, that system is continuously learning, is picking up as each document, as each set of documents is being reviewed. The system is updating, and it's then providing the scoring based on the classification model. From there's a couple different models that are used for review. One is a prioritization where the highest scoring documents are reviewed first. That's typically not what's brought forward when we're dealing with HSRs, when we're trying to get to the model as fast as possible. And you'll hear things like a coverage review for the other model, where the system is focusing on the documents that it doesn't know about, similar to the active learning in 1.0. And based on that, its understanding gets developed by looking at what it doesn't know and splitting those and getting to the point that you have and can be able to identify that cutoff score between the likely relevant and the not likely relevant. So those are the two main models we're talking about today. You'll hear it might start seeing more documentation or conversations about other, numerical values, other types of processes, but this is really what we're focusing on.
Excellent. Thanks, David. So now we're going to move into talking about some of the differences between TAR 1.0 and 2.0. Azra, could you talk about some of the key differences that you've seen in terms of the application of the two methodologies?
Sure, absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind too, today's conversation is really focused on HSR investigations, so second requests. And those have some unique characteristics that are different from what you might encounter in a litigation. And that might impact, the decision that you're making and some of these factors as far as speed, time, and flexibility. So, from a TAR 1.0 to a TAR 2.0, as David had been explaining, TAR 1.0, you come in, you have people who know the case, and they code a seed set of documents. This is something that the agencies have, particularly the DOJ, have been insisting on to ensure that you're not just throwing contract attorneys who know nothing about the case to code that control seed set, because it's so important to get those decisions correct, because that's what the whole model is going to be training against. So, one thing that you have to consider when you're doing TAR 1.0 is, that you're going to have to use attorneys, outside counsel who know the case well, are far more expensive than contract attorneys to do that initial review. So that takes time because they also have other things to do typically, and it's also expensive. So that's one thing to consider in TAR 1.0. One of the advantages with TAR 2.0 to consider when you're in the HSR context is before to a second request, as many of you know, we have an initial waiting period. It could be 30 days or it could be extended up to 60. So during that period, how much work have you been doing in identifying significant documents that are going to help you then be able, that you could use to essentially for your TAR 2.0 model. If you have that set of, relevant documents that you've already identified, that's going to help you go through the process as well. In some cases, you don't have those documents and you might have gotten surprised by a second request. And in that situation, you're not going to have that same type of, you would not have identified that responsive set that you want to be able to use to start your 2.0 process. A couple other things are just, flexibility. So are you doing rolling productions? Have you been able to negotiate your custodians right up front with the agencies? Or is this something that is, you are rushing to comply, you've predetermined who they are, but there might be some surprises and you might need to add in additional custodians? Or are you trying to do kind of a quick look where you're just collecting for a small number of custodians and then the agencies could request more later? In that situation, again, 2.0 has advantages over 1.0 because you will be able to, it's more amenable to adding new documents to the population because you don't have to retrain that initial model. One of the other differences with TAR 2.0 and 1.0 to keep in mind with second requests, one of the advantages of TAR 2.0 is that if you have a low richness in your data set, TAR 2.0 could work. It has some advantages because you don't have to review as many documents as you might have to in TAR 1.0 to have a good sample. But when we're dealing with second requests, that's typically not as much of an issue for us because it is such a broad request, and there's so many categories of documents that we typically have a much higher richness or prevalence rate in our document sets than you might find in the litigation that's just focused on one key issue. So that's something that distinguishes us and isn't necessarily going to, make TAR 2.0 necessarily the absolute clear answer as far as best strategy. And then, so I've said a lot. I also want to allow others to weigh in as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Azra. You definitely are a tough act to follow with the list of all the differences. Jessica, what are your thoughts in terms of, in your practice, when you use TAR 1.0 versus 2.0, what are some of the key differences that you've seen between the two models that, you're advising clients on when they're deciding what route to take?
Yeah, thanks. I would probably echo a lot of what was just said, truthfully. I think one thing that we've experienced lately, sort of anecdotally, is that with both agencies, it's taking a bit longer than we had previously experienced to get some sort of basic negotiation points out of the way, like a custodian list. And in that situation where you kind of have the scope of the second request is really in flux, I think TAR 2.0 has a clear advantage, as Sarah said, that it allows you to add documents in without having to completely retrain the system. I think probably, one of the other things to consider is that TAR 1.0 is something that the agencies are very comfortable with at this point in time. They understand it. They have, set metrics they're looking for. And so when you're negotiating with them or trying to come up with your overall strategy, you may have to do a little bit more explaining and dive a little bit deeper in a TAR 2.0 model to make sure that they're comfortable with, what your approach is. Whereas I think at this point in time, TAR 1.0, they are clearly, they understand, they get it, and I feel very comfortable with people coming in with that approach. So those are kind of the two eating things there, is flexibility versus, negotiating with the agencies.
And the other thing to also note, just on TAR 2.0, it definitely has many advantages. However, one of the things that David was talking about was just about the fact that you have to review from various different categories, so that category model, to ensure that you're identifying documents that are relevant in the number of different categories. In second request, you have a number of various categories. So the documents that you might initially identify as significant, let's say you found them in your initial waiting period or elsewhere or otherwise, there's numerous, it's not, strange to have 40 different specifications, different categories of documents. So you're going to have to draw documents from all of these various and identify documents in these various categories, even if they're not necessarily significant for the substantive issues in the case. And so that's something that you have to consider as well. And given the broad scope of a second request, that can actually be quite time consuming. So the advantages that you get in using TAR 2.0, while they might be very clear in a litigation context, can get more nuanced in a second request context.
Yeah, I think that's right. And when you were talking about sort of the documents you identify during the waiting period, those tend to be very deal related, very specific to the deal. And the second request, as you said, are much, much broader than that. So you have to take that into account when you're sort of pulling together your seed set and working off of that. The documents you may have identified up until you get the second request as being significant and important may be very, very often are very heavily deal related, whereas the second request is looking for documents that are much, much, much broader than just what is relevant to the deal itself.
That's a perfect point, Jessica, because you're really, in that initial waiting period, the documents that you typically identified are your item 4 documents.
Exactly. Yep. Your 4C documents for your.
Exactly.
Yep.
So they're all deal related, or the other significant documents that you typically spend your time on during that initial waiting period are documents that you're trying to exclude from the scope.
Exactly. Yep.
So it's, I think it's probably more of the exception than the rule that you're doing work identifying substantive documents on these other categories that are going to be responsive to a second request. So good point, Jessica.
Well, I'm excited to announce that we have our first question to the panelists, which is, which costs more, TAR 1.0 or 2.0? So Azra kind of touched on how a 1.0 model requires, maybe higher cost for attorneys doing the initial coding of the seed set, opposed to contract attorneys, for example, which weighs costs on 1.0. David, since you're on the Lighthouse side, could you give us some perspective in terms of TAR 1.0 and 2.0 and from a cost perspective?
Sure. I mean, the one thing is that, the cost of the model, the cost of the, sort of that process using the 1.0 versus the 2.0 model, the main costs aren't in that part. You do have that training, that initial review that's required in developing the model in the 1.0, and you're dealing with the subject matter experts. You're using, the attorneys, the higher cost attorneys, where the 2.0 can get broadened, to get to that point of identifying that R set that needs to move forward for production. But those really end up balancing out, and those aren't the hard metrics in the cost. What you really need to start looking at is where the costly review is, and that's after that R set has been identified. Once you've got that cutoff score, you then take what's subject to production, and then everything has to be reviewed for privilege. Not everything, but you run your privilege screen, and then you take that resulting set, and that's where really the expensive review comes into place. And that's where you've got to have eyes on all those documents. You've got to engage a review team in either model. So you have that R set, and getting to that point is as fast as possible is obviously desired. But then it's that being aware that cost of review is where the biggest impact is going to come, and that's sort of agnostic for what model is used to get you to that point.
I think that's I think that's a good point in terms of when we're talking level setting for people who are not necessarily familiar with second requests versus litigations. And I know litigators who might be listening to this are just clutch their pearls and be horrified. But in second requests, as you said, we produce generally a lot of documents that don't have eyes on them. So when you're making these decisions, litigation versus HSR, our focus is making sure that privilege doesn't get in there and getting the documents out as quickly as possible, which is not necessarily the posture you're going to take in a litigation where you want to really have a dive understanding of everything you're turning over. So that's a good point to bring up. I think, again, sort of, we talked at the beginning, the difference between second requests versus litigations when you're trying to figure out these approaches.
Yeah, and Jessica, there's a lot of interest, I think, in the TAR 2.0 experience from the panel. We're getting some questions. You just answered one of them, which is when you use the TAR 2.0 model for a second request, do you review every document that gets produced prior to production, which the answer is no, which you answered. I guess just to kind of dig into that a little bit more for the audience, in terms of review, do you take any different approaches with the TAR 2.0 model versus a 1.0 in terms of the number of documents that are getting reviewed?
I mean, I don't think so. I think the workflows look very similar in that you want to get the algorithm set so you're comfortable with the numbers and you have that cutoff point. And then you sort of take, okay, everything above this we're going to produce, and then you start applying your privilege screens. So really in terms of the numbers that get reviewed, it depends on how much pulling out of the initial data set the TAR 1.0 versus 2.0 is doing. But I think at the end of the day, the workflows look very similar. So I think the biggest thing with TAR 2.0 advantages, in my opinion, second request-wise, is that it does give you the flexibility if you do not have a set custodian list, the scope of the second request may be changing. You have a little bit more wiggle room there in terms of training the system with 1.0. But I think at the end of the day, the number of documents reviewed and how that works is pretty similar, in my opinion.
Right. So pretty similar, not eyes on every document, consistent with the 1.0 model.
I mean, that's a client and case specific, analysis as well. We don't, again, anecdotally, not bumped into a lot of clients that want eyes on everything because time is usually of the essence. But, you could obviously have a situation where you think you're going to litigation after, you think it's likely that you're going to be, in court defending this merger, going forward, and you may want to do more review. But I think in general, when you think that, second request is going to happen, we're going to get this cleared in some way, that most clients approach, sort of the cost-benefit analysis, that it is better, easier to get the documents to the agency faster, which means you would be just basically doing a privilege review.
So I think we can advance to the next. We do have a couple of questions coming in about the validation process for 2.0 and just this panel's success in negotiating 2.0. So that's great to see the engagement from the audience and those questions, but we will get to that on the slide after this one. So first, let's just talk a little bit more about when we would recommend 1.0 over 2.0 and then vice versa, 2.0 over 1.0. So first, we're going to start with David, who's going to talk about scenarios in which 1.0 may be used over 2.0, and then June's going to provide some perspective on 2.0 over 1.0. So David, I'll kick it off to you on 1.0 over 2.0.
Sure. There's a few things when we're making recommendations and looking at projects and engaging with the clients and counsel. Typically, when the data collection, you have the data, you have the collection, and everything's been identified. So a lot of what's been talked about, Oscar and Jessica mentioning when things are, early on and pre-request, that things are in flux. But if you have that opportunity, you've got the data, you've got the collection for the most part, and you can, the 1.0 model does come into play, and then we can make a recommendation with that. The 1.0 model tends to be a little more rigid. Again, we're creating that, creating the classification model, doing that work up front, and then applying that to the data set. So you want to have as much of the data as possible, because every time you then would roll in additional data, if you do some supplemental collections or additional collections, there's frequently the refresh collection. That has to be rolled into the model, and a lot of times the model will need to be updated before it can move forward. So you have that, you have the benefit of having that data up front. That is something that lends itself a lot to the TAR 1.0 model, that you can go in and build that. Also along those lines, the type of data. So if you've got the collection and you've got just good user-generated content, if you will. So you've got your exchange for you've got your email, you've got your documents and PDFs and PowerPoint and presentations and things like that. That lends itself where you don't have data that is subject to a lot of scientific information or nuances within the data. Because it's text-based analysis is underlying. I haven't talked about that, but being that the text-based analysis is what's being used, you want to have the systems be able to understand and make the most of that data. So when you have that, kind of clean, straight data that lends itself, we find it lends itself to the 1.0 model pretty well. And up to date, I will say from my experience has been a lot with the TAR 1.0 model, but 2.0 has been developing and things are changing. But you're able to get through the document data that we're talking about volumes. Just sort of anecdotally, a couple of projects we've done recently, we had about 1 million documents set, a little over that, and the review required about 6,000, just a little about 6,100 documents to get to that, to identify what was the R set in the million docs. It was about 0.5% of the total review. We had another one that was 2 million docs, and it was able to get to that point a little bit quicker with about 5,600 documents. So you're trying to get to that as quickly as possible, and those are TAR 1.0 models. But as Jessica and I'll let June kind of mention, the 2.0 model is allowing us to get to that point as well without having to delve into the data. So those are a couple of things that we bring forward in our recommendations of the 1.0 model.
June, how about 2.0? When would you recommend 2.0 over 1.0?
Yeah, so thank you, David. I mean, he brought up some very good points as to when 1.0 would be good. Again, you need to start from a vision of what case am I working on, what type of data am I looking at, and what's the best approach for going from there. Assuming once you are comfortable with TAR, there are a couple of situations in which I feel like TAR 2.0, you may be more inclined to use TAR 2.0. One is when time is of the essence. And when you're dealing with second requests, time is like gold. It's sort of like what toilet paper is during the pandemic now. It's just gold. And you love it. You don't have much of it, so you learn to value it. With HSRs, they're typically large amounts of data to collect that you need to review and produce, and you need to do it within a truncated time span. So it's very rare that you're going to have the luxury to have a subject matter expert complete the training of your control set before you have to begin your review. You want to get off and running, and you want to do it pretty quickly. Since TAR 2.0 is an active and continuous learning program, you can start your document review much sooner using 2.0 than you would using 1.0, because you don't have to wait for the subject matter expert or the SME to complete the control set. And additionally, you really have no idea how long it's going to take that SME to complete that control set. So that's in second request where time is really of the essence. That's a point in which you really want to give TAR 2.0 a really second look. Another one is issue that both Jessica and Ezra both identified, and that is when you have rolling data. So when you don't have all the data you need accurately to train the algorithm, then you probably need to defer to a TAR 2.0 versus 1.0. With most HSRs, you're going to be receiving it on a rolling data basis, and this could be due to ever-changing custodian list. It also can be due to negotiations that you're having with the agency to either negotiate a specification to either drop a relevant product or adjust a relevant service area. And so things are still pretty much in flux with that. So you don't have all of the data that you need. Since the 2.0 system is continually ranking documents to get you to your relevant stack, it can handle the digestions of new documents, and the removal of old documents with relative ease. Unlike TAR 1.0, which assumes that all the documents that have been received before the ranking occurs, and therefore it does not allow you the opportunity to change or make adjustments based on either new custodians or new information or instructions. So that's another key point situation in which TAR 2.0 may work better for you in your case. The third one I want to bring up is when you have key issues and topics, as both Ezra and Jessica mentioned. Second requests are really broad. There's a lot of information in there. And so sometimes your team may want to be aware of certain key issues, certain topics that they want to be kept abreast of before you do a production. Well, if you're using TAR 2.0, you can actually go in and you can develop a separate algorithm based on those key issues and based on those key topics. You can bifurcate those reviews so that your senior members of your team can be reviewing your special issue and special topics review, and that won't interfere with the first level review that is ongoing. So some of those are issues in which I see 2.0 having an advantage over using TAR 1.0.
Chris, one other thing to bring up and sort of, if you've got it on the slide, but the type of data I had mentioned, sort of that straight data that, the email and your document type collections and things. We're getting more and more collections of, special documents that might be specific to a specific industry, but we're also talking about mobile data, text data. So the development of the process for that and the more, widely sort of broad inclusion of those data sets are changing the model. The TAR 1.0 model, does create some challenges when it comes to that data, where the 2.0 model and looking at the smaller data sets and the different data sets comes into play and may be more appropriate. And so we're seeing some of the data types certainly making an impact on what recommendations and what direction to go.
Right, although I would want to make the point that, predictive coding isn't a silver bullet. So it's not going to be appropriate for all data types. In fact, there's there's numerous types of data that are just, not classifiable by the algorithm because of the nature of the file. It's too large, it's too small. And text messages are particularly something that we have been struggling with because they're becoming more and more prevalent in the investigations that we're doing. People are starting to use their phones a lot more to actually have substantive discussions about things. And the agencies are, in the recent second requests with both agencies that I've worked on, they have absolutely insisted on text messages to the extent that there are any responsive ones, and have gone out of their way to make clear that that is something that is, deemed a document and part of the scope of the second request. The problem is that the way we get text message reports are typically just a very large spreadsheet, which, TAR isn't going to help you to try to identify what, which specific communications are relevant. And then trying to break those down into smaller portions, like just, each communication, each text, its own file, then makes it too small for predictive coding in many situations. So, in some cases, it's not even a question of TAR 1.0 versus 2.0, but it's a question of whether predictive coding is even appropriate for that file type.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think it's something to take into account whenever you're doing this. You said it's not like you're not going to be able to take into account, regardless which model you use, you're going to have data sets that you're going to have to handle separately. So that's just something also take account when you're trying to make the decisions and set up your workflow. And also when talking to the agencies that you, no matter what, I can't really envision any situation when you aren't going to have some category of documents that the algorithm just isn't going to know what to do with, in which case you're going to have to figure out how you want to handle that based on the volume, if you want to do eyes on everything, if you want to do search terms. And as you said, text messages and chats in particular present their own unique challenge, because either you have every text message that someone has sent to another person for X number of years in a giant spreadsheet, or you have them individually in which you don't have any context. And not only is it difficult for the algorithm to figure out, but it's difficult for your reviewers to figure out what's going on. So regardless which model you use, that's something you have to take into consideration. You will have a set that you're going to have to kind of handle separately.
And when you're thinking about the universe of those type of documents, that mobile data, the things that TAR just isn't going to work with, when you are conducting your custodian interviews, that's an excellent time to kind of dig down into those and figure out how many structured databases you're working with, and get a sense of what the volume of that could possibly be, because that can have a direct impact on what technology you're going to use right up front.
Great points. I think we can move to the next slide. And this is a highly anticipated slide, I think, based on the questions we've gotten so far. People are interested. Will the DOJ accept TAR 2.0 productions? What are the requirements for validation? People are interested in hearing from June, Azra, and Jessica about their experience negotiating the use of TAR 2.0 with the DOJ, and the timeline, if there's any differences in terms of timeline for acceptance for 1.0 versus 2.0. So that kind of ties into all this slide, but those are some of the questions from the audience that people are trying to get out of this conversation. I guess, Azra, do you want to start and just kind of talk about some of the key strategies for negotiating 1.0 with the government? Maybe we can take it a 1.0 and 2.0 negotiation strategy, and then maybe talk about some of the differences between the DOJ and the FTC.
Right. So I would probably say, the first step is just letting them know what you're doing. And that's required now by both agencies to let them know what process you're going to be using. I saw a question come up from the audience as far as whether, they're accepting the use of search terms plus TAR. And that is something that, we would not, I think maybe when people were first starting to use TAR, that was something that, you could consider, because it was at least to tighten, not even for your responsiveness, but just to tighten up what you're reviewing from like a privilege standpoint. However, what we really have been seeing is that you can't combine search terms plus TAR. Part of the reason you're using TAR and the agencies are willing to accept it is because there's been a lot of studies that have shown that it's more accurate, right? You're going to have a higher precision than you do with search terms, and because of linguistic limitations and other things. So if you first apply search terms and then TAR, you're handicapped by that linguistic limitation. So your recall is going to be a lot lower than if you were just using TAR. As far as the negotiations, I think the first step obviously is to let them know what you're doing and have that conversation. As June has been, noting, time is definitely of the essence. And so you want to have that conversation early on. You want to make sure that they're comfortable with it. And we have seen the DOJ more than the FTC requesting, I think it's been standard practice for many years now, to request review of non-responsive samples. And by doing that, it's a way to be able to validate the results. So it's like, and in my view, how you get there, whether you're using TAR 1.0 or whether you're using TAR 2.0, and the technology that gets you there, as long as you have statistically significant samples drawn randomly from your population that they can review and ensure that you are meeting that recall that you have agreed upon, then it really validates your process of getting there. And so I know from a litigation standpoint, just because you mentioned earlier, litigators are really uncomfortable with letting, the adversarial party look at anything that is, not necessary. And in second request, it's slightly different. Our precision rates are sometimes a little horrifying, quite frankly. We are producing, not only are we producing a lot of documents that haven't, sight unseen, but we're also producing a lot of documents that we know are not responsive, because to get that precision higher, it's going to be very timely and time consuming, which, as you mentioned, is gold, and then also very costly. So turning over a sample of not responsive documents is not as painful in a second request context as it is in a litigation. And I think it's a great way to be able to validate your method, regardless of what you're using, whether it's search terms, TAR 1.0 or TAR 2.0.
Jessica and June, any other thoughts on key strategies for negotiations for either model?
Just to follow on what Sarah was saying, that I think the DOJ tends to be a little bit more stringent in its review of what you're doing versus the FTC. They, require more upfront negotiation. Strategically, I think it's always a good idea, as you said, to go in and disclose what you're doing to the agency so they can kind of get comfortable with it, because that puts you in a better situation at the end when you've complied. If there are any issues, you can at least go back and say, well, we discussed all of this and everyone signed off on our approach. But I think the DOJ definitely requires more upfront information, whereas the FTC is a little less concerned about that. And I think the DOJ definitely requires, they want to look at a null set, they want to check out your NR documents, that kind of thing. The FTC doesn't necessarily require that. I think it's probably going to depend on which, group you're dealing with in either agency, how comfortable they are negotiating, how comfortable they are with TAR 1.0, how comfortable they are with TAR 2.0. But, I think it's just sort of in general, you just need to be prepared to give transparency into what your process has been if you're going to use a TAR approach with the agencies, which I think you don't necessarily have to give as much information about what your sort of internal review structure looks like if you're using another method of using search terms or you're looking at everything. But that's sort of the trade-off, using the technology versus putting eyes on everything.
So when other questions come in related to negotiating TAR with the government, they're asking the panel if you've ever faced a circumstance where the DOJ or the FTC have rejected your TAR results and forced you to go back to re-review all documents. Is that something that's happened in your experience or something that you're aware of happening?
From my perspective, God, no.
Yeah, no, not here.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
But it's also because, going back to the beginning point, we have, we do our internal validation. So we do statistical samples. We ensure that we're getting the results we want. And again, it comes back to statistics, right? And so then if the agency is doing a validation with DOJ, they should be getting the same results you are. So we do those internal checks before we produce anything and sign off on the model.
Yeah, agreed. And I also think it depends on the entire posture of your case. If you're in a situation where it seems likely that it's going to go on to litigation, I think that we need to really take a closer look at everything, and the agencies are probably going to be taking a much closer look at everything. Whereas if you're in a situation where, you've got divestitures up front that everyone's kind of comfortable with, or this is an exercise mostly to get the agency comfortable with the, the deal, but you don't foresee it, taking it beyond the second request process. I think that it's probably more likely that you're going to get, that laser focused eyes on kind of focus on the results after the fact if you are looking at going on to litigation later. So, but anecdotally, we've never experienced them coming back, and I've never heard of anyone having an issue where they've come back and said, no, it didn't work.
So let's go ahead and wrap up the best practices slide, and then we'll move into more of the formal Q&A. I think there's still a couple of questions out there in the chat and in the Q&A section. We are going to turn to Q&A next. So for all of those in attendance, now is a good time to start getting the questions queued up for June, Azra, Jessica, and David. So first, we're just going to talk about some best practices here. So June, do you want to elaborate on some of the best practices around using TAR in a HSR second request context in particular? Yeah,
so, a best practice, I think we feel, is that the very first thing you need to do is that you need to understand your case, and you need to understand the data you will need to review. And then you need to make a determination whether or not TAR is the right approach for you. I think Azra and Jessica both mentioned that the first question should be to TAR or not to TAR to figure out what is best. For example, TAR is better utilized when it is applied to text-based documents. Therefore, if your collection includes a lot of structured databases, if it includes a lot of Excel spreadsheets, MS Calendar outlooks, IM and mobile data, chat, then the TAR approach, whether it be 1.0 or 2.0, may not be the best one for you to use. You're going to have to use another culling mechanism to get to the universe of documents. I think Ezra mentioned, and Jessica and I have both seen this too, that there has been an increase with companies and clients using chat and instant messaging more often, and they are using it to talk about what can be considered potentially responsive information. So it's not whether or not you're going to have to produce those things. It's just how you're going to have to produce them. It's just coming up with the best method to get that data and review that. So that needs to be key to understand that whether or not TAR or a particular technology, to assess what technology is going to be best based on your client and the data. And like I said, when you go in and you start determining who you need to collect data from with second request, your custodian interviews can be a really key point as to assessing how we need to do this review, how we need to call down this universe, making sure you're asking the appropriate questions then so you can get to the right technology next.
Azra, Jessica, David, any other best practices or words of wisdom for the audience on TAR?
It doesn't work for predictive coding. So again, not a silver bullet. You need to understand the technology and know that it's not just a button that you push that's going to generate all of the responsive and, your production side essentially. So, just understanding it and, there's conversations with these and e-discovery vendors who are more than happy to educate you on everything you need to know about TAR.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing is that, you start out and you may have a plan. It's very important to sort of monitor and keep track of everything that's going on initially. And if something isn't working, you can change streams, right? You don't have to commit to one practice versus another. Obviously, you hope whatever you planned is going to work great and everything is going to, be beautiful. It's going to be the best production you've ever had and no one's going to have any questions. But I think it's very important early on in the process when you're starting to, as June said, custodian interviews are very important. Understanding your client, industry, all that stuff is extremely important. But on some level, until you really start to get into the documents and the data, it's kind of hard to tell what you're dealing with. So I think in the early stages, it's really important that, if you're heading up this process, that you're sort of monitoring that very carefully and understanding what you're seeing and what's working and what's not, and then make whatever adjustments you need to make. And if that's that you choose one method to pull your data and it's not working, you have to switch to something else, then you switch to something else. But the goal at the end of the day, as I think everyone has touched on, is to have a process that is, efficient, accurate, and defensible in front of the agencies, and you're getting what they need in a timeline that is best for your client.
And that actually raises a really important point, Jessica, that, one of the things that you're doing, and, June, you brought this up in custodian interviews, but second requests can sometimes have very diverse, whether it's business entities, whether it's business departments, product markets, geographies, that could have very different data sets, essentially. And so, as Jessica mentioned, some of the things you just have to be ready to adapt and evolve. As you're training your model, if you're starting to see that the results aren't what you need because the diversity in your population, you might need to reconsider and consider, having separate algorithms or something like that so that you can best, tackle that population set, depending on your facts.
One more thing that I would add, sitting from the service provider side, identified, is the collaboration. We come and we have our experience, we have our understanding, and we have, Lighthouse, we have a team that, has broad approach and broad experience. But, we bring that to the table, but we're engaged, and, we've got a great panel here with having a person, I would say, worked with OSRA, but, Jessica and June have their, the breadth of their experience, and it's putting those together. Making our recommendations, but we're also listening to what counsel is, what the client brings, and putting that together. As much as as talk about the time is of the essence. These conversations don't, we're not talking weeks and weeks of conversations, but it's taking the time to have the conversations, maintain the communications throughout the process, in a give and a take, to move things forward. And those have been, we find the most successful when we were able to do that.
And I think that raises an important point, too. I've seen it happen too often where the SMEs, the substantive, subject matter experts, ignore the e-discovery process. And they just think of it as something that's happening in a warehouse. You just put a bunch of contract attorneys on it and magic is going to happen. And in a short period of time, they're going to have exactly the documents they need. And the more that you integrate the substance with the e-discovery process so that you can make those smart decisions as far as how do you adjust, your review processes, how do you adjust your algorithms, what are the relevant documents you need to be focusing on, the more that that's integrated or coordinated, the better of a result you will have, more efficient, cost-effective, timely, etc. So, it really should be integrated. Don't ignore e-discovery. Combine it with your substantive review and analysis.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And June and I have talked about this a lot, is that, 100%, and then that the e-discovery process can work for you on the substance side. So it's really, really important that, from the vendor to the share partner who's, driving the entire ship is sort of, not everybody has to be on every phone call or anything like that, but really the more everyone's communicating and kind of on the same page, you can make this process, which is truthfully very onerous for clients. It's a lot of work for the law firm, all that kind of stuff, but you can really make it work for you on the substance side and sort of advocating for the deal. And I mean, again, I'm sorry, June and I have talked about this a million times that, in the different case teams approach things differently. But I think in general, the more integrated you can get these processes and kind of meld everything together, that, you can make this sort of bureaucratic, process work for you on the substance side as well.
Great. So I think we're going to move into some Q&A. for the last 6 minutes or so here. We're still getting quite a few questions about the 2.0 validation process. I know we've talked a lot about transparency. I guess maybe, and this may be more of a question for David, but are there specific validation processes or techniques or statistics that would be different when negotiating 2.0 or validating a 2.0 process versus a 1.0? Or is it essentially the same conversation, same statistics of precision and recall?
Yeah, it really does come down to the metrics and the statistics. And different models, the 1.0 model seems to have the metrics you're dealing with, a control set up front, and the metrics are all derived from that over the training that'll allow you to sort of more simply get to the validation. We're talking about validations and taking statistical samples and doing those review to verify and validate the results to move forward. It is the same with 2.0. Sometimes in some of the systems are developing more to be more automated versus sort of being that mathematician, statistician to derive the metrics, but it is all driven, metrics driven to be able to establish what your baseline is and that you're validating on those. And then once you've gotten that, that's when we keep talking about stability and confirming the model, say, the results are as expected, the statistics bear it out, and then you can move forward with the data sets. So.
I do want to make a point, though, that with TAR 1.0, the DOJ has been requesting a lot of the, kind of statistics regarding the working models and rounds. And they want to be able to see that your model is stabilizing because they know TAR 1.0, they've learned a lot about it, and they want to see those metrics. We've pushed back a number of times, that's work product and that they just need to validate our not responsive samples. And I think probably with decreasing success, I think they're starting to insist on that more and more. I think with TAR 2.0, it's a different process, right? You're not stabilizing the model. You're getting to the point where you're realizing that you've met the prevalence and you've identified what's responsive. So I think it's just, it's going to, again, it comes down, in my view, it really comes down to just validating that not responsive sample. That gets you what you need, but the DOJ needs to be comfortable with that as well, knowing that they're not going to get the same working round metrics for TAR 2.0 that they necessarily would for TAR 1.0.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And it's not that the DOJ hasn't validated TAR 2.0 processes, they have. It's just, I think you may have to engage, you said they're very comfortable with the 1.0 process, they understand how it works. And in general, experience and based on documentation and what's required, the DOJ is a lot more stringent in what they're requiring than the FTC is. But you can get them there, and I don't think it's necessarily that difficult, but you're probably going to have, there's going to be more give and take and more conversations that you have to have, whereas I think with TAR 2.0, with 1.0, they sort of have, as you said, an understandable set of metrics they're looking for, and you provide them, and they're comfortable with that. With the TAR 2.0 model, you may have to do more, more talking to and sort of massaging them and getting them there, but you can get them there, and I don't know that it necessarily takes them that long to get there. Definitely depends on who you're dealing with. Different divisions and different groups of attorneys there are more or less comfortable. They have obviously their experts that handle the technical side and their e-discovery experts, but some groups are more or less reluctant to embrace newer technologies. But I think you just be prepared to have to, maybe do a little bit more explaining and a little bit more drilling down to kind of get them comfortable with what the entire process looks like, because with 1.0, they're very comfortable and understand what that looks like, and 2.0, they may not be as familiar.
And what I found to be really effective is even just having a call between the DOJ and the e-discovery vendor and saying, talk to each other, ask any questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I think we've all found that communication is key.
Yep.
It can build trust, and it can make sure that everyone's on the same page. So communication is key.
Yeah.
So we are approaching the top of the hour. We can go over a few minutes if the panelists have a few extra minutes to answer some of the other outstanding questions. But before we do that, we want to make sure that we share the survey link for the CLE credits before noon. So that has just been posted into the chat or comments section. If you don't see the chat window on your screen, scroll towards the bottom and click on the little chat bubble, and then that will pop up so that you can complete the survey for the CLE credits. But we can go over maybe a couple minutes. I don't know if the panel has time because there are a couple of other outstanding questions. I think maybe we'll just take one more question and then we'll wrap up from there as people complete the survey. I think this might be an interesting question to end on, just because it's a classic e-discovery philosophical question about TAR 1.0/2.0 versus search terms. And, what is a better protocol for culling data? Is it search terms or TAR 1.0 or 2.0? Be interesting maybe just to kind of wrap up to see the panelists' perspective on that, because I know we've talked about it in some of the prep sessions.
Okay, I'll jump in. There's been, like I mentioned earlier, so many studies. Search terms have linguistic limitations. Tracy Greer at the DOJ, who's, heading up their e-discovery unit, is not a fan of them for good reason. You use different words within an organization, and so you don't just have generic terms that are going to capture everything you're looking for. Search terms can work on, some smaller data sets, like when we're talking about text messages and things like that, but search terms require a level of negotiation and can take a lot more time to negotiate than negotiating a TAR protocol, whether it's TAR 1.0 or TAR 2.0. So both between the linguistic limitations, which contribute to a lower level of recall, and then also and then perhaps precision if you have overly broad search terms. And then also the fact that it just takes so long to negotiate search terms with the agencies. I have been advocating to use predictive coding since I think 2012, and have used it on essentially every single second request I've worked on since then. And so, search terms might be appropriate, like I said, on a very limited data set when nothing else works, but definitely a fan of predictive coding when appropriate for second requests. But it also, and then as far as TAR 1.0 versus 2.0, I'm a fan of, evolving technology. And so if we are developing technology that allows us to get to our final answer, whatever is going to allow me to get there in the most efficient and cost-effective way, that is what I am hopefully going to be using, taking into consideration all of the different things that we've talked about today on this panel, which could be unique for different second requests.
Okay, and just to argue the opposite side of this, I agree with a lot of what you said there, 100%. I actually think that search terms can work and do work in a lot of situations. If you know your client, if you know the industry, if you understand how they talk about things, particularly if you have a client that you've been working with on an ongoing basis, and you have a really robust set of search terms. Anecdotally, I think, and June would agree with this, we have not really encountered much time or much effort negotiating search terms with either agency. We submit them, and they generally say, okay, or we'd like to add these 20 whatever terms, and we're done. I think the biggest thing in terms of advantages with search terms that I identify is that, unlike when you're using a TAR model, you're committed to that, right? You're like, these are the numbers we have, this is the responsive set, and the only way you can remove anything from that set is if it's privileged, right, with the agencies. With search terms, if there's something embarrassing that the CEO emailed to somebody that mentions, that gets in there somehow, I can pull that out. If I'm looking at the privilege log and I'm dealing with the timing agreement with the DOJ, which has all those, you can only reinsert X percentage of documents for each custodian when you do your privilege log, I can knock stuff off because it's non-responsive. And substantively, if there's something in there that your client's concerned about that's not technically responsive to the second request, but may raise questions in another area, I can get rid of all of that. So I think you have to make I don't think it's necessarily a one-size-fits-all situation. I think TAR works great. We've used it, we like it, but I think there are other situations where search terms may be the better fit, including, particularly in front of the DOJ, if you do not want to take that time to negotiate sort of the entire TAR process up front. And if your client has some concerns about sort of other things that may be in the data set that they may want to pull out because TAR does not give you all of that flexibility. But I think June spoke to this before, the most important thing with all of this is that you sit down and kind of understand what the case team's goals are, what the client's concerns are, what your data is going to look like, and kind of make a decision based on the totality of circumstances and decide which approach is best for you. So we don't discard search terms out of hand, and I don't think we're Luddites or whatever. We're not using technology, and there's a lot of other kind of things that technically fall into TAR that you can use along with search terms to call that data set down. But so again, just to argue the other side, but it's sort of very eloquently argued for TAR. I think there are some situations when search terms can work for you.
I agree, Jessica. I agree with you. And like we all have mentioned, you actually do have to look at your case and you have to see what is going to work best. I happen to like things that don't decrease my flexibility. If there is something that is really non-responsive to the request and could be possibly embarrassing to the client, I like the ability to remove non-responsive, embarrassing documents. And that could, you want to have that flexibility to do that if you can. And I like that. Also like things that can possibly decrease my privilege burden. If I don't have to constantly have to log non-responsive privileged families or standalone documents, that's huge because that's a lot of where your cost is going to come from, and that's a lot of where the time is going to come from. So you may want to just consider that also.
And I think that that's an important point, for practitioners, for us, and for practitioners on the call. The position that you are taking, I take a lot of objection, or I'm not saying that correctly, but I do not appreciate that if you are using TAR that you cannot downgrade not responsive documents, because that really is not, TAR is getting you to a recall, but then if you're trying to tighten up your precision, you should have every ability to do so. You should not be obligated to produce not responsive documents just because of the methodology that you're using to identify responsive documents. And so I think taking a consistent stand to say, as antitrust attorneys, I'm not asking that we conspire here, but I'm saying that, I think that that's a very legitimate position to take when you're using TAR. And so that shouldn't, I would hope that it evolves to a point that isn't a downside aspect of using TAR.
No, I agree 100%. Like, I think if you could take that element out of it, I think that changes the equation entirely. And I think that is, as you said, for practitioners, I think that's a fundamental difference between when you're negotiating a process in a litigation where both sides have obligations and have, want to have that kind of flexibility. I think you're in a better position to be able to say we can, there are all these kind of things that we can do to kind of allow us both to get our data set where we need it to be, as long as there's transparency and everyone understands what's happening. When you're in a second request posture, there's no obligation on the other side. And it's also technically not an adversarial process, right? It's just an investigation. No wrongdoing has been, you're just basically saying, they're like, we want this information, and you say here. So there's not really a lot of wiggle room with the agencies to say, well, we don't want to do X, Y, or Z. So I agree with you 100%. If that requirement could be taken out of the TAR process for second request, that would change the game a lot from my perspective in terms of how you approach dealing with these.
That was great, and I think that's probably a great question to end on since we're 10 minutes over, and I will say that they all warned me that they could talk about this for hours, so I'm not surprised that we went 10 minutes over. I also think it's fitting that we ended in true debate style. I felt like we were finally getting into the debate. It took an hour, but we finally got to the debate. I just want to thank June, Audra, Jessica, and David again. Thank you so much for investing the time in this webinar and the conversation, and thank you to all the attendees who joined and those that stayed on these extra few minutes here. So thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And again, the PDF version of the presentation will be sent out after this, and look forward to seeing you on future Illuminations webinars. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.